So here I'm gonna show you how to French and truss a pork crown roast. So when you go to the butcher, the ideal cut you're looking for is a full bone-in pork roast. So this is essentially the prime rib of pork. It has a beautiful white fat cap across the top. On the side here, you have the spinalis, the loin, you have all the inner muscles for a beautiful French chop. So to jump right into this, what we're gonna do is we're gonna score the sides of the membrane. So I like to have a slicer, sharp slicer, and a boning knife on hand. So make it a lot easier to work with. Just about 1 inch above that loin, you're gonna score it all the way to the bone. Okay. Turn the whole roast 180. You're gonna do the same thing on the other end. You'll notice that the size of the loin will slightly change. On this end, it'll taper a little bit. This is the blade end, this is the chuck end. This is the ideal end of our pork prime rib roast. Lots of meat, lots of great muscles here. We're gonna score it about a 1/2 inch above the loin here because there is some extra muscles that we wanna save in the portions when we cut the chops when you go to serve it. Okay. So now it's scored on each end. All you're gonna do with your slicer is you're gonna connect that. You're gonna be scoring through the membrane to the bone. So with some good pressure here, slice right across from it and you should hear like a tick, 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 tick as your knife is hitting the bone. Okay, I'm gonna flip it over. So on each end, you have the marks that you scored it. Again, you're gonna slice all the way down to the bone. So you're cutting through a lot of meat, a lot of fat here, mostly fat. So you're not gonna be able to cut all the way through to the bone in one clean slice. So just go slow, steady, and don't saw at it. This is a lot easier to handle when it's very, very cold, while the fat is really firm. Go all the way down to the bone. Probably can't hear it, but I can feel hitting the bone. It's like clicking. The dry towel, I like to put that down. As this meat warms up again, it's gonna get a little slippery. It is dry, but the juices might make it move around the board. We're gonna lift up the fat here with our slicer. So there's a membrane right around the ribs, and that's what's holding all of this meat, all this fat connected to the bone. So the better you score that membrane, the easier this whole chain is gonna come right off. I like to work slow, really precise cuts. It'll make your life a lot easier when you go to remove this chain, because if you don't do a good job, a lot of meat will still be attached to that chain and you're gonna spend a lot of time having to clean it up. I can see each bone here. So I'm inserting the tip of my knife between them. What I'm doing is I'm coming around to the other side. I already have this mark where I scored through the membrane, and I'm just making sure the tip of my knife is right through that cut. Even though you think your knife is parallel to the board, you're straight, you might come in way too low, like right there. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for the tip, I'm adjusting, boom, right where I need to be. Moving on to the next rib, kind of at an angle here, cutting around, flipping the knife over, making sure I'm coming out the right spot. And boom, it's the little sawing action there. This technique doesn't matter how many bones you have. Even if it's a 3-bone roast, 10 bone, it's all the same. Make sure you get the ends well. Now with the ribs facing towards you, this is when I would change to a boning knife. Paring knife, fruit knife, utility knife, something small and pretty sharp at the tip. The whole knife doesn't need to be that sharp. I'm using a Japanese boning knife here. Might seem wild, but it's actually not sharp here. So I'm really choking up with it. You want a lot of control here because you're gonna be putting a lot of pressure on the bone and you don't wanna slip around too much. So now we're gonna score the bones starting from one side, going all the way to the other. You see these like opaque lines? It looks like the bone. You're like, that's where I'm gonna cut through. Actually, that's not what you want to do. The bone is just to the left of that, just to the right of it. So what I like to do is reference the tip of the bone here at the very end. Feel the bone, it runs straight up. So that's what I'm scoring along, is the bone right here. Even though it seems like it's the bone, looks like it's the bone, it's not. Use your fingers, it's gonna tell you where to score. So here, I got the bone where I scored it earlier. I'm gonna slice through, and this membrane is a little slippery here. So you don't wanna just slowly cut against it because that membrane's gonna slide over and you're gonna cut through the meat. It's not the end of the world, but I'm just gonna show you the proper technique. So I get about halfway through and I cut back. Feel it, I got the bone here, cut about halfway through, step to the side. This is also a process you can stop at any point. If you get distracted, your meat starts warming up, throw it back in the fridge, you can come back to it. So this is the chuck end again. So this is the loin end, rib end. As you work this way, there will be less fat and the membrane will get much thinner. You know, even though it's the same technique all the way across, it will be changing slightly as you go down the animal. Like here, there's a lot more meat. Needing to feel a little bit more to see where to cut. Now all the bones are scored. Now I'm gonna start peeling back the membrane around the bone. Right here at the very tip of the rib, I'm just gonna press it to the side. So here I am not cutting. We've already done the cutting. I'm just scraping, peeling that membrane back. Once you get to the edge here, just a little pressure, peels back. The shape of the bones going down this rack will change slightly. They're not completely oval. As you work down the rack of the rib, they will become more oval. So all I'm doing is with the side of the knife, scraping it to the side. So as this warms up, that membrane will want to stick more to the rib and you might need to do more of a scraping action. But again, make sure it is peeled off of the rib all the way on the sides, because when you go to peel off the chain, it will remove much easier. And you're gonna move on to the next rib. One mistake I made early on when I was doing a lot of butchery was anytime I ran into a tricky bone or I got frustrated with a part of it, I just moved right on to the next bone. I was always like, oh, I'll just come back to this one. But if you start scraping the membrane back and you move on to the next bone, and you come back to it later, it'll really have warmed up and it will be much, much more of a headache. So just pick one side of the rack and work all the way down. I like to wipe off the blade as I go. You don't need any of that fat making you slip around. I've gone through 4 bones. Membrane's pushed out on the sides. The only spot where it's still connected is at the very top of the rib here. Now I'm at the very end of the loin end of the rack. This end is easier in my opinion. The bones are more oval. The membrane scrapes off a little bit easier. So I choose to start with the chuck, the blade, the shoulder end first because that's the trickier one. So I do that while it's the coldest. It's looking pretty good. What I do at this point is go back through, make sure the membrane is scraped back and just the tips of the rib. Now the chain should remove off with some ease. In butchery shops, you'll see them holding these like big metal hooks. Those are great for leverage of moving around large primal cuts or subprimals. They're also great for gripping onto the bone. If you don't have one of those, easiest thing I have around at home is like a simple metal S-hook. That is a great thing to use to grip onto the bone to peel that membrane. It gives you a little more leverage. I like to fold up just a dry paper towel, put that into the hook. I want to put it around the top of the bone, and then I'm going to insert my thumb between the rib, and that's going to help pinch the meat, keeping it intact to the chain, and peel it off. I'm going to move on to the next bone. A little meat, a little membrane is still attached there, that's okay. We're going to come back to that after we remove the chain and clean it up. So there, I had a good amount of membrane still attached. It's okay. Scrape it off a little bit. Continue pulling the bone. As I'm working down the rack, at the beginning on the chuck end, these bones are straight up and down. So I'm just peeling, pulling, just right across it. As these bones go at an angle, you want to pull the bone back in the same direction that it's going. Last bone. Boom. There's the chine. This is a great cut. Lots of times you will see this discarded, but we're gonna use this for our recipe in the pork crown. This is gonna braise up really, really well because in between here, all this connective tissue is gonna braise a very succulent piece of meat. So now we're gonna go back to our boning knife, your dull petty knife, and we're just gonna scrape the bones. I'm not a big fan of scraping the meat down. It will look pretty, but then all you will then is have a bunch of shaved meat pressed into your roast. I like to scrape up. That way I can remove all those scraps of meat. Big chunk there. So just put a little extra love into it. That way these bones are pristine and white. You can see I have a good chunk of meat still attached there. Let's get your slicer out, trim it off. Having this much membrane attached is not uncommon. Beef and lamb, I find that the membrane's a little bit thicker and it peels off a little bit better. So you probably won't have to spend as much time scraping it. Never hurts to take a dry towel, just polish the bones a little bit. The whole rack is attached by a large chine bone. At the butcher shop, that will pretty much almost always will be cut off using a bandsaw. If it's not removed, there is no way you can actually cut between these bones. But when they remove it with a bandsaw, the very tip of the chine bone is still left in there, just below the tip of each rib here. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. The chine bones are very close to the ribs here, and right here, the chine bones are a little bit farther. That means when they were removing the chine bones with the bandsaw, they took a little too much of the meat. It's very important to remove these because once this is roasted up, those chine bones are gonna move around a little bit. And when you try and portion your chops, you're gonna hit that bone. So you're not gonna get clean cuts. So using the tip of your boning knife or paring knife, you're gonna just kind of scoop it out. You're gonna like shuck it out of there. These chine bones usually go, usually not much more than a 1/4 inch deep. So using the tip of your knife, you're gonna feel it, and you're just gonna kind of start carving around the bone. I'm gonna put the roast back on the towel. That way I can move it around a little easier. Mostly gonna have meats on the sides of it. There's gonna be membrane at the very bottom or the tip of the chine bone that's connecting it. So once you cut around it, you're gonna get the tip of your knife just below it. Cut it up. Save them for pan sauces, stocks, whatever you want, or just get rid of them. So just like anything with this process, pick one end, and just work all the way across it. So one thing I'm doing too is I'm being pretty mindful of how I'm touching the meat. If I'm moving this around, I'm really trying to move it around by the bone because the more you touch the meat, the faster it's gonna warm up. You know, and you might even be surprised. The rack you buy from the butcher shop might not have any of these chine bones in it. Depending on who you're buying it from, maybe 1 out of 10 might not have them. Again, that's just how they were cut on the bandsaw before you bought it. So we got it Frenched. We got the chine bones removed on the bottom. Now we're gonna flip it over and take a look at the fat cap. I think there was a point in my career when I saw a fat cap and was like, fat caps just mean it's better. Leave it on, cook it off and serve it. But all that fat, depending on your cooking method, doesn't mean it's gonna render out. Then you're just gonna be serving up a huge chunk of fat with a small eye of the loin. So I recommend trimming down that fat cap to about 1/4 inch, maybe down to a 1/2 inch if you're planning on searing it, or if it's a roast that it will render, but we're just gonna trim it down a little bit, make sure it's nice and even running across the whole loin. So looking at the chuck end, for the most part, it's pretty good. It's maybe just a little thicker than a 1/4 inch. It's getting a little thicker on each of these ends. We're gonna take a look at the other end, the rib, the loin end. Fat cap is pretty much non-existent right here. So there's gonna be no trimming needed. This is really important because you can see on this rack that someone's already cut this. They've already scored it a little bit. Even if you're buying from the same purveyor, same butcher shop, same store, it's gonna look a little bit different. So assess it first before you start just trimming fat away. So what I'm seeing here is I wanna remove a little bit of fat just on this tip part, maybe a little back here. I like to remove the fat with a slicer if I'm gonna be doing that, just slicing off thin ribbons. Don't do any large chunks because you can't put it back on. All right, you can always just do thinner slices as you go. Almost like you're cutting some prosciutto, gravlax. So you shouldn't be shaving off any more than that at a time. Areas where there is a lot more fat will feel a lot firmer. So there are some subtle signs that you could be looking for, especially if you're a seasoned butcher, but there's a little bit of guessing, especially if you're new to this. So look at the ends, use that as an indicator of the thickness. But remember, just because you trim the ends down to 1/4 inch, that does not mean it's at a 1/4 inch in the middle. Okay, so just shave it away a little bit at a time. And once I think I'm getting pretty close to about, depending on your thickness you want, 1/4 inch or a 1/2 inch, I actually like to scrape away the fat. So just with the side of the knife, pointed down, not at an angle, okay? So anywhere where there's these like cut marks that I had left from removing the ribbons of fat, check it out. Those will get rounded off. All that fat's coming off. Scrape it away. The fat cap on the loin end was a lot thinner. I'm avoiding that area. Don't be afraid to pull your roast to the very edge of the cutting board. That's better for you to get those hard to get angles of the fat cap at the very bottom of it. We've trimmed it down a little bit. Still seeing a little bit too much fat at the lower part of this cap. Just gonna trim that away. So our fat cap's dialed in, bones are all Frenched up, chine bones are removed. Last thing we need to do is just truss this up. Trussing does have some functionality, in my opinion. It's gonna help it cook a little bit more even. The shape is gonna be a little tighter, more cylindrical, less oval, so it'll cook at an even rate. So there is purpose behind it. I like to cut butcher's twine to about 16 inches long. I feel like that gives me enough extra string to tie it real tight. So 1 piece of string per bone. You might need 1 or 2 extra for the very ends. So on the chuck end, there isn't much extra meat here, so there isn't room to truss it up. But as you can see on this loin end right here, there's a good portion right there. So we will use a piece of string there. So I like to start by putting the string directly in the middle. So what I'm gonna do is grab the string in the middle, pull it nice and taut with my thumbs here, press my thumbs into the board, and then kind of like with a sawing motion, I'm gonna scrape just along the board to the very middle of the roast. Having the string nice and taut like that helps guarantee that the string is straight. If you're a little floppy with it, that string is probably at a S shape or something, and so it is not going to look beautiful at the very end. So pull it tight. Okay. Triple loop. If you know, you know. Triple loop is going to help get a really tight knot. Okay. On to the next one. Thumbs down. Slide it through. One thing that's nice about trussing after you remove the chine bone is if that chine bone is still in there when you're tying these knots, that bone inevitably is going to push the string to one side or the other of the rib. And so your portions for the chops will be a little out of whack. So this is a great skill to know, even if you're buying a French and trussed roast from the store. Not all butcher shops are going to tie them super tight. So don't be afraid. If it's looking a little loose, to just cut those strings and to retruss it up if you want. Another reason too is I find after roasting, once you remove that string, those areas where that string was is super easy to slice through with your slicer. You're not going to be fighting against this nice crust or anything. Portioning is a breeze. So you'll notice too that I'm not tying the knot quite yet. I'm getting all this twine staged. Then I'm going to check my spacing before I tie that knot. You can adjust it if you need to. Look at both sides. One more firm tie. Boom. Flick the string off one way. You know, you're really not yanking on this. It should just be a firm tie. If you pull too hard, you will cut through the fat. You don't want to do that. Just a firm tie. Every step of this process, kind of thinking of it like an assembly line. Trying to minimize, moving around your cutting board, touching things, got all the string adjusted on there, tied all the knots. Then I'm just gonna zip back through with some kitchen scissors, cut the string. Look at that, we did it. Beautiful trussed Frenched pork roast. This is the prime rib of pork. I actually don't recommend cooking a whole roast, all 10 bones, because the chuck end and the loin, the rib end, they're different thicknesses and they will roast at different rates. But you totally can cook those together if you want. But my favorite section from this is the first 6 bones from the shoulder chuck end or blade end. Here, you're gonna have nice spinalis, lot of intercostal muscle, connective tissue, lots of flavor, great ratio of fat to meat. So this is like the prime end that I would look for, whether it's beef or pork. So this is the best end. So I'm gonna cut that off of here. Again, this is the first 6 bones. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At a butcher shop, these are usually how you would find them. This is separated from the chuck, the shoulder end. This is the loin rib end. You know, it still has a cap, but the meat itself is a lot more lean. So if someone's looking for just a simple pork loin, this is the cut you're gonna be going for. But if you're looking for something a little more interesting, the shoulder, the chuck end, the blade end, this is what you're looking for. It still has the cap to it. You know, this is the ribeye of pork. So this is the great one. It's Frenched beautifully. We remove the chine bones. The fat cap is down to about 1/4 inch thick. At this point, if you have a giant fat cap, this is when you'd score it. But because ours is trimmed down, we're gonna skip that part. All right, so there you have it. That's how to French a pork crown roast.
Subscribe to our channel and visit chefsteps.com for more tips, recipes, guides, and tools to help you level up in the kitchen.